My friend invited me to a sleepover at his house. We weren't allowed to wake up before his parents. When I was 11, I was at the very bottom of my class until the teacher, Ms. Henry, made me sit next to the new kid. Thomas and his family moved into town halfway through term, so he just sort of appeared one day. During his second week, Ms. Henry tried to draw him out of his shell by asking about his favorite TV program. "What's a TV program?" he replied. That got a laugh. Clearly, he was playing dumb to put one over on her. Everybody thought he'd emerge as the next class clown, but instead he rarely spoke and aced every subject. A few girls tried befriending him. They dug that Children of the Corn look, I guess, but agreed he was a weirdo after chatting with him in the lunch hall. As desk buddies, he and I locked horns. A lot. Because I was left-handed, our elbows bumped together whenever we wrote, and he got super pissed anytime I asked to borrow a pencil, so I of course did this as often as possible. Anytime I asked Ms. Henry to split us up, she'd just sneer and say, "Ryan, there's gonna be times in life when you're forced to spend time with people you don't like. Get used to it." One day, as I struggled with a difficult maths exam, Thomas offered to help. I'm guessing he finished early and got bored. It was my first A. Without either of us ever agreeing to it, he started helping me with homework and tough assignments, and soon my grades improved so much my mom bought me a bunch of Pokemon cards. As reward, I offered Thomas some of the one I already owned, but he didn't even know what a Pokemon's was. Then one day, out of the blue, he asked if I'd sleep over at his place. "Father really wants to meet you," he said. Why did his parents even know who I was? We sat together, sure, but he knew so little about pop culture. Getting through a conversation was like chewing cult. Still, I wanted to thank him for his help, and my mom didn't raise any objections, so that Friday I packed some clothes and cycled over to his place. I drove down several short roads flanked by woods, past a train station, toward the outskirts of town. Thomas's two-story house sat at the top of a long driveway so steep that I needed to jump off my bike and push most of the way, and all the windows were either boarded up or had the curtains pulled shut. Things got spooky the second I arrived. Thomas and his parents waited patiently to greet me, each grinning like they were on a poster for tooth whitening. Everybody had matching blonde hair and dressed in plain shades of brown, gray, and white. A large man introduced them as the Donovans. My pre-teen brain categorized him and his wife as old, but in retrospect there must have been a 20-year age difference there. Mr. Donovan walked my bike into the garage while me and Thomas followed his mom inside. Something was wrong with the house. It looked too sterile. No clutter, zero toys scattered about. Plus, the antique furniture was older than my grandparents'. In every room, sheets had been draped over objects mounted along the paneled walls, and Mrs. Donovan made a point of telling me that touching the sheets is strictly forbidden. She led us into a sitting room decorated with crucifixes, and more crucifixes, of varying sizes. We kneeled down on a colorful rug, facing each other. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. At last Mr. Donovan joined our group and led a prayer for the standard stuff: good health, blessed weather. Even though I'd gone to Protestant church with my grandparents, I couldn't figure out what religion we were meant to be practicing. He obviously thought of himself as a spiritual leader and devoted a lot of time to the blind sinners who would suffer swift retribution on Judgment Day. It wasn't until he called for a minute of holy silence that I heard a low, shaken voice. I concentrated hard, tuning out the clock. There were muffled cries. From somewhere within the room, I peeked my left eye open. Nobody was watching, although the way the family didn't stop grinning made me shiver. I glanced around the room. We were alone. When I turned back towards the circle, Thomas's mom was staring straight at me, her smile practically splitting the seams of her face. Quickly, I shut my eyes, already anxious to go home. The silence seemed to last forever. Finally, the spiritual leader clapped his hands and said we should go out back and toss a ball around. On my way out of the room, I listened for more cries, but the sound had died off. I figured my imagination got the better of me. As Thomas and I tossed a leather ball back and forth in the long grass, His dad watched from a crude decking area, beaming. Like at school, Thomas threw with his right hand, whereas I favored my left. We kept trying to pass each other bad shots, competing to make the other miss a catch. It was all in good fun, though. Thomas acted even weirder than at school. Away from his parents, he at least seemed interested in subjects like TV, but now he strictly spoke about Bible stories and recited his favorite verses. I sidestepped his questions my spirituality as much as I could. My arm was aching by the time Mrs. Donovan called us for dinner. In the kitchen, we gathered around the table, and then she brought in a metal pan, presenting 5 boneless chicken breasts lathered in lumpy gravy and canned peaches. Before we ate, everybody linked arms for another prayer, and part of me wished the ritual would never end, because then we'd need to choke down the food. A heavy silence fell over the room, then those cries started up again. Closer than before. It sounded like a child, and their voice had a panicky quality. If it wasn't for the threat of another glare from Thomas's mom, I would have peeked. As the prayer dragged on, the crying became more hysterical, until finally something rattled against the wall behind me. Mr. Donovan's voice raised, thunderous now, and drowned out the sound. I'm not sure which scared me more, but either way my arms broke out in goosebumps. The sermon ended 5 minutes later, and we sat there in silence until the head of the table said, "Amen." I checked the corners for sobbing children, finding only more sheets. What then? A CD player. My imagination. The uncooked chicken made me gag. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I picked around the moldy peaches and spread out the plate so it looked like I'd eaten more than I actually had. There was chocolate cake for dessert, but Thomas's mom went around slicing a piece onto each of our plates, which were still covered with chicken and gravy. By that point, my stomach was growling, so I scoffed down a top layer of cake, which hadn't touched anything else. I wanted to leave. Faking a bellyache, I asked if they would call my mom and have her come pick me up. Thomas's dad raised an eyebrow. "No need, we have a special remedy." He told the rest of the family to pray for my health and led me out of the room. The front door was on my left, and I briefly considered making a run for it. But the second I did, Mr. Donovan's hand clamped around my shoulder tight. His smile never wavered, but something about his eyes made me break out in goosebumps, like an implied threat. So I let him guide me into a vintage bathroom. There was a covered cabinet above the sink, and the tub was already full. A thick layer of scud plus a few dead flies floated along the surface. Mr. Donovan poured something into the murky water, salt, maybe, and ordered me to strip off my t-shirt so I could dip my midsection in. I told him I'd made a miraculous recovery. "Ah, the power of prayer," he said, grinning so wide I could count the back teeth. After that, he announced it was time for bed, despite the fact it wasn't even dark yet. Upstairs, at the very far end of the hall, a huge object spanning the width of both walls was covered by another sheet. We got ushered me into Thomas's room, which was even more dull and lifeless than the rest of the house. A queen-size bed, one small cupboard, and a single wooden chair tucked in the corner. We needed to share the bed, but only after another round of prayer. Then, it was lights out before 9 o'clock. Alone with my friend, I rolled over and asked what religion his family practiced anyway. He gave the vaguest answers possible, and when I pushed him, became hyper-defensive. So I said, "Hey, do you ever want to punch Miss Henry right in her stupid, ugly face?" That made him laugh. Away from his parents, he became more like his school self. Not normal, but closer than before. We argued over who the hottest girl in class was, followed by the most annoying. Without meaning to, I brought up one who always teased him, and it was like all the energy leaked out of my new friend. "I know everybody thinks I'm odd," he sighed. "They just need to get to know you like I did. They'll come around." "You think so?" "Absolutely." He smiled. Then, after a little while, he said, "Hey, want to see something creepy? I'll show you if you think you're brave enough not to wet the bed." I rolled my eyes. He wanted to rattle me, like when we played ball. "Sure. We've got to wait until Mother and Father retire for the night." I kept asking what he had planned, but he wouldn't answer. He got a kick out of keeping me in the dark, I think. He waited until the house fell quiet and then swung his legs out of bed. This way. In the chilly, dark hall, enough moonlight shone through the windows beside the staircase to see by. As we tiptoed past several closed doors, that crying returned, growing louder as we approached the object beneath the black sheet. Not my imagination then. Facing me, Thomas whispered, "Don't worry if he looks at you. Just make sure you look away fast. You'll be fine so long as you look away fast." Before I could ask what that meant, he crouched down, grabbed the corner of the sheet, and pulled it back, revealing an antique armoire. Suddenly, the crying became less muffled. A mirrored panel ran along the bottom section, surrounded by fine, gargoyle-like carvings. Still holding the blanket, Thomas pushed his left ear against the carpet and stared at the glass. "He's there. Come look quick. I just wanted to get this over with." I lay down. For a second, I stared at the reflected hall, confused about why we were even there. But then an out-of-place shape caught my eye. I told myself it was my reflection, but then realized I had no reflection. A boy was standing in the corner with his back to us. His shoulders went up and down like he couldn't stop sobbing. "Do you see him?" Thomas asked. I swallowed a gulp, my blood running cold. "Nito." "Ha." My brain scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, or a nasty prank. I looked behind me. Nothing. Only a bare patch of wall. "He's not there," Thomas said. "Only in the mirror." When I looked back, the boy was much closer and crouched on his side, nose to nose with me. His features were all stretched out, long and narrow, like a funhouse mirror, and he had a shock of blonde hair to go with them. His thin lips twisted into a grotesque smile as the boy reached out to me, the tips of his fingers pushing through the glass into reality. I couldn't move a muscle until his face is only inches away from mine, his breath blasting me in the face like a gust of cold air. I scrambled away. If my throat hadn't hitched itself shut, I would have screamed. Quickly, Thomas dropped the sheet and dragged me up by the shoulder, then shoved me down the hall. Behind us, the armoire thrashed from side to side, its hinges squeaking, the boy crying again. Now his voice had an almost hysterical quality. Back in the safety of his room, Thomas pressed his ear against the door until the armoire quietened down. "We are blessed Father didn't hear," he said. "Now we sleep. Father said we aren't to rise before he wakes us to begin the morning ritual." He must not have been the least bit scared by what we saw, because he ushered me into bed and dozed off straight away. But my body wouldn't quit trembling. What was that thing in the mirror? Were there more of them? Is that why they hung sheets everywhere? But why keep any mirrors at all? One thing was for sure, I couldn't spend the night in that house. But Thomas's dad would never let me go. I needed to get the hell out of there without being seen. After Thomas's breathing eased into a rhythm, I swung my legs onto the floor and tiptoed out of the room, toward the stairs. But as I approached the top, footsteps came clumping along. I ducked behind the nearest door. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mr. Donovan march past with a rectangular object tucked beneath his arm. There was a tinkling sound from beneath the sheet. He carried it over to Thomas's room, grunting the whole way, and disappeared through the door. My stomach lurched into my throat. I didn't want to find out what he had planned. I flew down the stairs, carefully, quietly. I kept my hand against the wall for guidance. The front door was locked. My bike still was in the garage, I hoped, but how did I get there from the landing? Above my head there were angry shouts of, "He's gone." No time for plans. I sprinted around the ground floor, flying from room to room. Cries rang out in every one, and now the objects beneath the sheets danced on the walls, bouncing around. The crying child sounded terrified now, like they were in pain. Past the kitchen, there was a cramped utility room with another door. The temperature plummeted as I bolted through it, into the garage. The light switch was on the inside wall. I flicked it, then a naked bulb blinked on. Junk was scattered everywhere: car parts, step ladders, boxes of old newspapers, and more sheets thrown over different mirrors, each flapping and twisting. There were more cries, except not just the boy, and for a second I was afraid to move. But then a door slammed shut behind me, and I ran for it. My bike was propped up against the wall beside the exit, its handlebars stubbornly tangled with a Christmas tree. After a few tugs, it came loose, and it was like setting off a Rube Goldberg machine. A mop and bucket fell into a stepladder, which clattered to the floor and sent a bag of marbles sprawling across the floor, and so on. I grabbed the bike's handlebars. The exit was one of those old fold-up doors you needed to twist the handle to open. My hands were shaking so badly I needed to set the bike aside and focus solely on this task. The door rotated up. Behind me, Thomas's dad burst into the room, and for the first time he'd stopped smiling. He rushed after me, but struggled to get through the minefield of junk. My bike's rear wheel became tangled with a sheet, and when I started running it came away like a magician ripping away a tablecloth. I heard the mirror fall to the floor and shatter. Laughter rang out, and when I glanced back over my shoulder, bone-thin arms were reaching out of the glass towards Mr. Donovan. As the garage light rapidly flicked on and off, Mr. Donovan screamed. I will never, as long as I live, forget the terror in that scream. Pure adrenaline got me out of there. Without slowing down, I sprinted to the top of the driveway and leapt onto the bike and flew down the hill. Behind me, screams rang out from deeper in the house. I didn't stop to look back. Mom wasn't pleased about me cycling home so late, but I made up an excuse about Thomas's family getting sick and needing to leave in a hurry, so she let it slide. I knew she'd never believe my story. I tried faking an illness to get out of school because I was so anxious about seeing Thomas again, but she was having none of it. I spent all of Saturday and Sunday wondering about what I'd seen. On Monday, my desk buddy sat without breathing a single word. We never spoke again, and we didn't bump elbows once. To my great relief, MS, Henry announced Thomas's family had moved again the very next day. I never saw him after that, although for a while I had nightmares about his dad dragging me back inside their house, and they tend to flare up any time I see a mirror-fronted armoire. Next story. Everyone says my hometown doesn't exist. What happened to Casey Falls? Everyone says my hometown doesn't exist. I'm beginning to believe them, but that doesn't mean that was always the case. Let me back up. The first time I encountered this bizarre denial was after my first semester at college. I trekked to the Amtrak station, luggage in tow, and asked the attendant for one ticket to Casey Falls, Michigan, please. She looked up from her desk and blinked. Where? Casey Falls, Michigan, I repeated, a smidge slower this time. After she performed a search on her computer, then sought counsel from her manager, they determined that, if Casey Falls was a real place, it wasn't a stop on any of their lines. How can that be? I protested. I could see its train station as clearly in my mind's eye as their bewildered faces before me. Every spring break, I took the train with my family into Chicago, boarding at 7 o'clock in the morning at the platform just east of Berry Street. Dad would hand me $2 to buy a Coke and a bag of pretzels from the vending machines before the train arrived. My younger sister Janie and I sat impatiently on the benches waiting for our journey to begin. But relaying this memory to the exasperated attendants did little to correct their system, which omitted Casey Falls from its available destinations. I spent that Christmas alone in my dorm, desperately trying to get a hold of my family, but none of them answered. Mom, dad, sister, phone, email, text, Facebook, nothing. Even stranger was that, overnight, their online presence vanished. Erased socials, bounced emails. When I called again, a recording informed me that the numbers I was trying to reach had been disconnected. What is going on? The following 2 weeks ordinarily spent opening presents, reconnecting with high school friends, ringing in the new year were instead subsumed under my intense investigation. I scrubbed the internet for any mention of my hometown. I came up empty-handed, despite endless hours scouring Google, Yahoo, even Bing. I found no mention of the central Michigan burg, ensconced in forest, home to Casey Falls Army Training Camp and the defunct, collapsed copper mines. Even Google Maps erased Casey Falls from its records, where ordinarily I would see the cluster of homes and farms and Main Street. There was only a green swath of forest land. My hometown had literally been wiped off the map. Worse yet, it was beginning to disappear from my own memory. As break rolled on, and my ceaseless search failed to yield a shred of evidence of my hometown's existence, I noticed my own recollection of it fading. While staring bleary-eyed at the television on New Year's Eve, watching revelers crowd Times Square to watch the Spangled Ball drop, I realized I couldn't remember any previous New Year's Eve. How had I spent them in Casey Falls? Maybe it was common to forget a few, for their memories to bleed into one another, to mix up which party went with which year, but to lose every New Year's Eve from one's personal history. I felt hollow, and in the void where Casey Falls and my preceding 18 years of memories should have been, something dark and sinister lurked. When my roommate returned in January and saw that I'd been holed up in our dorm for the entire break, he naturally inquired what happened. What happened indeed was my mad response. Desperate for a memory of home, even if secondhand, I interrogated Sean. "Surely you remember me talking about home at some point, right?" I asked. And while he agreed that, surely, in our various 2 a.m. chats we must have touched on the subject, he was chagrined to admit nothing specific returned. The silver lining to this distressing chat was that I now had a partner. Sean, fascinated by my absent origin, took up the cause with me. He caught up quick, performing his own research online before arriving at the conclusion that we had to see for ourselves. So, on a weekend in late January, he drove us in his junky sedan into the heart of the Mitten, to where Casey Falls should have carved out a space for itself from the surrounding forest. To my horror, we found only trees. Where Maine should have intersected with Blanchard, there was only a dirt drive reaching back into the woods. Sean didn't think his car would handle the uneven road too well, but after some pleading, he acquiesced. We drove slow along the forested road, tree branches squeezing us into a tunnel of foliage. "Right here," I said. "Casey Falls should be right here." I leapt out of the car and raced through the woods. I'm not sure why. I don't think it was rational. Just my emotions taking control. A medley comprising anger, grief, confusion, fear, that propelled me through the underbrush until I tripped over something metal. I turned back to find a green box, like a geocache, resting on the forest floor. Inside, pages yellowed with age featured some sort of code scrawled across them, written with only half-decent penmanship. "What the hell is that?" asked Sean when he finally caught up to me. It was the question we tried pairing with an answer over the ensuing month. Neither of us were real code breakers, so we shopped the pages around campus, taking it to math nerds and professors in the hopes one of them might crack it. One by one, they tried their best to decipher the documents, but each one met invariably with defeat. One professor called it the toughest code she'd ever encountered, while another suggested in all likelihood the pages were rubbish. But the fact that I'd found it where my hometown should have been kept me from accepting the latter explanation. Something was written in those pages, something that helped explain what happened to Casey Falls. But I'll never uncover its secrets. Because on March 3rd, someone tore our dorm room apart, and the only thing they took with them was the coded pages. Spooked by this flagrant invasion of privacy, Sean told me he would pursue the Casey Falls mystery no further. He believed that by showing the documents around campus, we'd attracted the attention of the Fed, CIA, NSA, some other three-letter agency no one had ever heard of, and now we were being watched. "Whatever happened to your hometown," Sean said. "They don't want anyone to find out." The next week, Sean transferred out, enrolling in a school on the East Coast. He left without saying goodbye, another exit without ceremony. I've since taken a barista job to be able to stay in Chicago through the summer, since I've got nowhere else to go. While reckoning with the fact I've become an orphan, in every sense of the word, I can't help shaking the feeling that someone is watching me. Whatever happened to Casey Falls, it wasn't good. I can feel it in my bones, the unheard screams of family and neighbors vibrating in the marrow. I feel them, and it makes me sick, but I cling to the horror because it's all. Next story. I'm an artist who does freelance fetish art commissions. My latest client is wealthy but unusual. You can only hustle through so many empty gallery showings and openings and closings before you start thinking, fuck man, I'm spending more on oils than I'm selling these pieces for. And then you start cheaping out on supplies, because the walking suits who can afford art don't care enough to notice the difference between oil and acrylic, between linen canvas from Varese, Italy, and cotton from the dollar store, between brushstrokes made from traditional goat hair and brushstrokes made by some shitty synthetic. So now your art looks like shit, and worse yet, you're the only one who knows. But either way, you gotta try and sell these half-dead pieces of your soul. But still nobody's buying, and that whole time you're smoking on the fire escape, counting pennies and vaguely praying that the Catholic Church takes over the world again, because then you could get paid to paint 1,000 frescoes of Saint Francis of Assisi, and that's gotta be better than this. So you give up. You throw away your ambitions. You throw away your dignity. And you start doing fetish art commissions. And you discover, holy shit, do those deviants have a lot of money. I mean, I'm not saying I was comfortable right out of the gate. Financially comfortable. I mean, I don't mind freaky stuff, except for the few clients who tried to loop me into threesomes or whatever, probably just angling for a discount. But still, before I knew it, the commissions started flowing. Whether it was a quick digital painting of someone's original character, or this life-size acrylic on canvas of a guy on a St. Andrew's cross, I was finally getting paid for my work. And I could churn these pieces out. That's the beauty of being hyper-obsessive. I spent 3 decades behind an easel, mastering every aspect of the craft I could think to master. I put in the reps, and now, even if my work wasn't hanging in the Louvre, I could still paint a decent black and blue ass in about 10 minutes. It's not that I didn't care about the quality of the commissions, but, well, let's just say mechanics are more careful with their own cars. These weren't my cars. My cars were unsold, collecting dust in a storage unit 12 miles away. Word of mouth was brisk. My clients weren't used to having access to a classically trained artist, and soon I was so busy I had to reject projects. My waiting list was weeks long, even after raising my prices 4 times. I was already planning a vacation, maybe to focus on my own work for a little bit. But then, I was sitting at home one evening, putting the finishing touches on an impressionist interpretation of nipple clamps, when my laptop dinged. An anonymous email. That in and of itself wasn't weird. Most of my clients were anonymous, and, after receiving their commissions, I often understood why. It was a commission request, an easy one. The client simply requested that I, quote, paint the following reference image to the absolute best of my ability. All right, pal, I said to myself, I'll get to it if I get to it. I was just about to close the window when I happened to glance at the payment. I did a double take, counted the zeros again. Holy shit. An absurd amount of money, absolutely absurd. Yet I hesitated. I'd heard of clients like this from other artists. Clients who made ludicrous offers but demanded perfection and never actually paid up, no matter how good you were. Through sheer force of will, I closed the email. No point in trying to come to a clear-headed decision while dollar signs were doing square dances in my mind. My laptop dinged again. This time it was from my bank. The anonymous client had just e-transferred half the proposed payment. The deposit memo read, "Now you know I'm serious." Well. I suppose I do. I took a closer look at the email. Nothing strange there. The bank deposit didn't give me any new info either. Again, no surprises. In general, the more money someone was willing to spend, the more anonymous they could afford to be. All that was left was the reference image. My mouse hovered over the link. The half payment I'd received suddenly felt enormously heavy, like a boulder dangling above my head or a corpse in my arms. My mind flashed forward to me explaining to the police how the image ended up on my computer. But in the end, I clicked. It was a close-up shot. Macro. A lot of white adorned by red threads around the edges. In the middle, a forest green donut encircling a vast black pit. It took me a moment to identify it as an eye. The pupil stared slightly off and to the left, inspecting. What? The photographer? The studio? It was impossible to tell. It was skillfully done, not a single rogue reflection shimmering within the sclera. Okay, just an eye. That's not so bad. I'd been drawing eyes since I was a middle schooler zoning out in math class. Piece of cake. Or was it? All at once I felt self-conscious, as if the eye was some form of artistic judgment. The eye of a critic savoring this delicious moment, the moment right before my utter failure. Could I really do this? I asked myself. In retrospect, it was a redundant question. I knew the moment that money hit my account, I was going to take this job. I didn't let the client in on my internal back and forth. I just accepted the offer and asked for clarification on size, style, materials, and what would happen if my work wasn't up to their standard. Handling that from the jump might save dozens of hours down the line. In seconds, my laptop dinged again. Twice. The first was to tell me that more money had been deposited, this one with the note signing bonus. The second was another email from the client. It merely said, just work to the best of your ability. You can always try again next month. Same fee. I stared at my computer, slack-jawed, and the eye stared back. I'll admit, my first attempt wasn't my best. Let's call it self-sabotage, like I didn't believe I deserved this money. This client and job was too perfect. It covered all my monthly expenses and then some. Who was I to get this windfall when other artists, my friends, were out starving in the streets? I spent the whole month procrastinating, drinking acid sour gin cocktails in the sweltering August heat. On the final day of the deadline, I crammed maybe 4 hours of work into the eye. What came out was a lurid, pouting mess. A rush job. A hack job. Bright colors, quote-unquote artful splashes of digital paint serving to cover up the sloppy lines. The whole thing done with an extra fuzzy brush to hide the lack of detail. A caricaturist on the boardwalk would have been ashamed. The reply from the client came in seconds, not quite there. Give it another shot. Another ding. More money had been deposited. Instantly, I was red hot with shame and anger. Fuck this guy. Fuck this fucking kinky freak for making me feel this way. Fuck him for forcing me to take his money, even though I gladly accepted it like the slavering dog I was. I nearly threw my keyboard across the room, but I didn't. Instead, I made some instant coffee, opened up the reference image, and got to work on a new draft. This time I took it seriously. I tore my other half-finished pieces off the wall, canceled a few recently accepted commissions, and started planning. Ordinarily, I would pick a creative direction and do some sketches in that style, but the words "best of your ability" rang in my head. It left me with two questions. The first was, what did best of my ability mean to the client? Photorealism was the ready answer. That's what most rich people mean when they say great art, and this guy was certainly rich. I wrote photorealism on the wall. Then I considered the second question. If this is erotic art, what is the subject of the client's desire? Is it the eyelashes? The iris? The pupil? Tear ducts? Photorealism or not, I could still emphasize the fetishized feature, if I knew what it was. I couldn't outright ask the client. Obviously, he'd chosen me with the expectation that I knew what was sexy about a macro photo of an eye. Asking would give up the game, kill the golden goose, prove that I had no business working for him. That wouldn't do. I needed to guess. I settled on a mixed approach. On a digital canvas, I experimented with each of the qualities in turn, then mixed them together, elongating the lashes while brightening the iris, blackening the pupil so the faintly limpid sclera shone more brightly, lightly touching up the inside corner so the hint of a tear could be inferred in the duct. I spent weeks playing with the balance of these features before I was satisfied. On the last day of the month, I sent off the file. Within minutes, I had a reply. 2 replies, in fact. The first was the client not quite there. Give it another shot. The A key from that criticism was eased by the second reply. My monthly retainer had been deposited. I licked my lips. Back to the drawing board. I used the first 2 months of money to finally move out of my shitty bachelor. My new apartment had space for a studio, which I promised myself I'd set up once I nailed this commission. My clothes started getting fancier. I went to better restaurants, mostly alone. I struggled to spend time with my friends. Money was always a topic of conversation in those circles, and they all wanted to know what I'd done to become so successful. I couldn't be honest with them. You get that, right? So I whitewashed the details. I became nothing more than a highly qualified freelance artist who happened to luck into a few big commissions from rich clients. That was all technically true, the rancid kind of truth that curdles in your throat as you speak it. There's only so long you can speak that kind of truth. By the 4th month, I'd stopped going to gallery shows, ashamed by my mealy-mouthed answer to the question, "So, what are you working on?" By the 6th month, I'd stopped seeing friends entirely. The envy on their faces was too much. By the 9th month, I was dodging my parents, thanking God they didn't live in the same province. Before I knew it, it was just me and the eye. I entered a kind of fugue. With no direction from the client, it was up to me to seek new avenues, new approaches. My walls were covered with failed sketches and drafts, a 100-eyed beast staring down at my futile, amateurish efforts. Towards the end of the year, I ran out of steam entirely. Oh sure, I kept painting. I kept trying new styles and techniques. But in my heart, I knew none of these were to the best of my ability. For all my existential anguish, the client seemed completely unconcerned. Their emails remained professional and pleasant, replying to each iteration of the eye with a simple "not quite there. Give it another shot." And so I did. But eventually you've got to run out of shots, right? The client would have to get fed up eventually, and the fear of that slowly began to paralyze my process. The fear, the anxiety, it became overwhelming. I'd wake up in a full panic and collapse into bed at the end of the day, completely exhausted from the flood of adrenaline. I'd shut down my website almost 8 months earlier, sneering as my old clients left, burning the bridge as they crossed. At the time, I couldn't dream of a world where I took $100 commissions anymore. And now, I was stuck. Too terrified to move forward, too proud to move backward. Inspiration. It strikes at funny times, doesn't it? All I'd wanted was a haircut. My shaggy bangs kept falling into my eyes as I tried to paint. The barber, Syrian I think, motioned me into his chair. My weight barely depressed the pneumatic cushion. Despite being richer than I'd ever been, my fridge was empty. The barber mimed putting food in his mouth. "You must eat, my friend," he said. Yeah, I croaked back, wondering exactly how long it had been since I'd spoken to another person. He spun me to face the mirror and began his work. And who was the creature looking back at me from that mirror? The dehydrated remains of a man lost in the desert. The final, exhausted specimen of an endangered species. Aimless desperation and anger oozed from that face. A man capable of anything and everything. Which is when it all clicked. I leapt up from the chair and ran out, discarding the barber's sheet as I ran for the subway. I didn't even notice as his scissors sliced my cheek, not until the blood was running freely down my chest, staining my shirt. But by then I was already at my easel. The best of my abilities, it was so obvious. I grabbed my goat hair brushes from storage. I washed one of the Vorace linen canvases collecting dust in the basement. I pulled my oils, my real oils, from under my bed. I was rusty at first, not used to the physical heft of my tools after all my digital commissions. But each brushstroke was cleaner than the last, and each cut of my palette knife tighter, and within minutes, it was as if I'd never walked away from my dream of being a real artist. The afternoon turned to evening, the evening to night, the night to dawn, dawn to afternoon, afternoon to evening. I didn't care. How could I? This was the greatest I had ever been. If I could, I would have kept painting forever, sustained by genius alone. But every canvas has edges, and there's only so much perfection you can cram between them. I don't know how I knew I was done. All I knew was that I was done, that this was the one, that it absolutely had to be. I stepped back from the easel, only now looking down at my clothes, seeing all the paint and charcoal stains. I'd been so desperate to start that I hadn't even put on a smock. With shaky hands, I poured myself a glass of water, the first thing I'd had to drink since the day before. Halfway through the glass, I paused. My muscles tensed. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Someone was watching me. I peered through the windows. Nothing. To be certain, I drew the curtains. I closed my laptop. I even covered the peephole on my front door. Still, The feeling persisted. The only place I hadn't checked was. I looked towards the canvas. My opus, my masterpiece. The eye hadn't moved, it merely stared out at the world in the same position I'd painted it. And yet, while before it had been merely a painting, now it was. Well, not alive per se, but something approaching it. And as if to prove it, the eye blinked. I blinked back. We stared at each other, paralyzed, the seconds ticking away into minutes as an unreal feeling creeped slowly up my spine, as my mind slowly processed a single, terrible thought. You created this. Revulsion, denial, and horror burned through my head. There was a sudden awful lightness in my guts. I ran to the bathroom, puking up bile and water, half of it landing in the sink. Laying there on the bathroom tile, I tried desperately to tether myself back to reality. It was simple. It hadn't happened. The eye was frozen in place like paintings have always been for 100,000 years. The movement, it was the expression of a fevered, sleepless mind. I wasn't exactly in the best of places emotionally that I could admit to myself. Too much stress. It was time to take a break. A real break, maybe an institutional break. But if I did, would the client be there when I came back? Would he move on? I couldn't just walk away from that kind of money. Not just like that anyway. No, there must be another way. I paced the tiny bathroom, vomit sloshing against my feet like a neglected animal in a cage. I was too deep in thought to notice. Let's say it wasn't a hallucination. Let's say that when I went back outside, the eye was still moving. Well, I'd certainly accomplished something nobody else had ever done. An abomination, to be sure, but a harmless one. And truly, what client wouldn't be pleased? Slowly, horror gave way to satisfaction. I crept out of the bathroom and cautiously approached the easel. It was still moving. The eye wheeled around, scanning the room. I appraised my craft from the shadows, slightly outside its range of vision. The clean, perfect blood vessels, the stained glass iris, the charcoal black pupil. There was no doubt. This was it. This was the best of my ability. It was perfect. I stepped forward, and the pupil instantly found my face. Delicate lace eyelashes beat the air. I leaned forward to get a better look at my meal ticket, my prize. The eye seemed to shrink back, or tried to, but I'd fixed it in paint, pinned it to the canvas like a butterfly. All it could do was widen in terror, the pupil shrinking and expanding like a hyperventilating lung. I was grinning now, chuckling, watching the eye as it ping-ponged, looking for an escape route, any way out at all, but there wasn't. There isn't. Maybe you think I'm cruel for laughing, if you even believe me, but I promise my reaction was justified. It was funny, you just don't get the joke yet. There's something I haven't told you, but I'll tell you now, you see. It was my eye on that canvas. Behind my easel, I'd set up a mirror. For 28 hours straight, I'd stared into it, capturing every ounce of desperation, every molecule of pathetic cowardice. My vanity, my refusal to walk away, my gleeful abandonment of everything I loved about art. It was all there. An intimate portrayal of every dark, miserable part of my soul, done to the best of my ability. I took one last, long look. The eye ceased its panicked rolling and held my stare. Slowly, the pupil dilated, like an animal's when it sees a predator. Wider and wider, taking me in, all of me in, until it seemed like the iris would be swallowed whole. When I'd seen enough, I wrapped the canvas in brown butcher paper. My email to the client received an immediate reply. 10 minutes later, a car arrived outside my building, a sleek, dark luxury vehicle with windows so tinted I couldn't even see the driver. I laid the wrapped commission flat in the trunk, and the car sped off. 10 minutes after that, my inbox dinged. "This is perfect," it said. "Great job." My inbox dinged again. He'd sent me a bonus. He had another one for me next month. I couldn't make out what it was at first. Pink and fleshy surface dotted with downy hairs. I only figured it out the next morning as my razor glided down my cheek. It was a throat. My throat. That one I nailed after only a couple of months. You should have seen that great, bobbing Adam's apple, bouncing up and down in silent anxiety. I must say, I particularly enjoyed the slashes of color I made across the trachea. Such a lifelike texture. That's something only oils can really capture. Then it was my ear, my thigh, my buttock, my foot. As soon as I finish one commission, he's got another. I don't even have to raise my rates. He does it without asking. I suppose soon he'll have all of me, the entire collection. After that, I'll have to find something else to sell. Next story. The second coming of Christ has already come and gone. I should know. I performed his autopsy. It began with a black bag over my head. 6 or 7 men seizing me off the street on my way home from work, holding me at gunpoint in the back of a van. They explained in detail what would happen to my family if I didn't listen to them. Until that moment, torture was just a word. I had never given it much thought. I wasn't prepared to hear some of the things they told me. By the time they were loading me onto a helicopter, I would have done anything they asked. I arrived at the black site, kicked out of the chopper, where my feet hit the hard-packed wet mud with a splash. Black hood torn off so hard it hurt the skin on the tip of my nose, and then I got my first look at the place. Can't say if it met my expectations or not. I didn't have any idea where I was going, or what it was supposed to look like when I got there. Still, it managed to leave me feeling surprised. An abandoned village nestled in the jungle. Mostly one-room hovels, lots of corrugated iron. Here and there lay burned allotments. Dying pepper plants left untended, their fruit stamped into the earth by the passage of soldiers dressed in all black. Rotten fences and troughs to feed long-dead pigs and goats lay smashed to pieces. And then, lurking on a hill, like some architectural jump scare, was a 3-story hospital made of glass and steel. State of the art. Built in a place where tarmac was just a rumor. Officially, it had been put there by a charitable non-profit wanting to research novel diseases and potential cures deep in the jungle. Unofficially, it had always belonged to the CIA. A useful place to test strange things with box in the name. And when the time came, a useful place to dissect the impossible. Imagine my surprise when I was escorted by armed men to an office with my name on the door and discovered that I was to be in charge of its latest major project. Head of research printed on the glass, real official looking. Big black letters like I'd always worked there. First thing I thought was, how long do they intend to keep me here? But that didn't last long. That hospital became my home and has been ever since. Less than 24 hours after my arrival and I had my feet up on the desk, barking orders at lab technicians. I slipped into the role easier than I'd like to admit. You see, where they got me was on scientific curiosity. That's how they ensured I was on board with the project. That's why they never pointed a gun at me after day 1. They didn't have to. The second I saw that thing inside the Messiah's chest cavity, I was a willing asset. No more me, only the project. The discovery and the revelations. Lying on that slab, nestled in the flesh of an otherwise normal-looking man, was a white-hot piece of divinity. A pinprick in the fabric of reality. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like I'd spent my whole life seeing 2-dimensional shadows, and then I suddenly got a glimpse of the 3-dimensional shapes casting them. I haven't seen my children since they took me. Couldn't tell you their names. I was never the same after the first autopsy. No one in that place was sane after the scalpel first bit into his flesh. Attrition amongst the research staff was incredibly high. Every day another nurse seized by stigmata, or a once faithless lab technician struck by the call to write the third testament. The guards dealt with the unwilling members of the team. Traumatized scientists and clinicians lined up, one by one, against an exposed brick wall in the jungle heat and shot. I remember smoking in the cafeteria in between surgeries, nervously shaking as I tried to ignore the pop-pop-pop of some of my more stubborn colleagues being executed. And then back to work where I suppressed the feeling that I was the worst kind of traitor. Next day there'd be new faces scrubbing up and asking for orders, another pair of hands shipped in from God knows where. Back to cataloging divinity. At times I imagined joining the objectors, the people who found religion in a sterile black ops lab. But that thing we pulled out of him, that baffling enigma that burned the eyes, it consumed the project. Everything we learned about it felt like a quantum leap in our understanding of microbiology. We tested everything we could get our hands on: plants, animals, humans. I tried not to look any of them in the eye. Quiet people taken from some quiet part of the earth where they wouldn't be missed. All of them scared. Did they know? I mean, really know the suffering they were in for? Definitely not. They expected to be shot, I imagine. Not to wake up with the roof of their mouths lined with eyeballs. I'm ashamed to say, but those kinds of results invigorated me. Excited me, even. When it all fell apart, and I missed the evacuation, I got to finally rifle through all those classified documents where I discovered I hadn't been selected because I was some genius of microbiology, but rather because my psychological profile made it clear I'd do anything if you dangled a big enough mystery in front of me. That, and the fact that I was actually quite good at managing projects. Geniuses usually aren't great at sending out memos or keeping track of performance numbers. Thankfully, I'm no genius. It was humbling at times, working with some of the guys down below, being senior to them even. I mean, Dr. Coates was probably the smartest man I'd ever met. No real academic career, because he had a habit of hyperfixating on things that either couldn't be solved or which no one gave a shit about. But it was pretty clear this was a guy who could have turned his brain to just about anything and made a name for himself if he was just a little more on the ball. He was an odd-on, basically. Gave lectures barefoot. Would respond to last-minute marking deadlines by giving every student a B. Threw a stapler at the head of his department. That kind of thing. Intelligent, but not particularly sensible. The project broke him, broke his worldview, broke his mind and, towards the end, even his body. You might think the problem was asking a hyper-rational man to process the divine, but if anything, he processed it a little too well. He was the first person to read the Third Testament without going insane. Immediately insane, I should say. Or maybe he was always nuts to begin with. Either way, he managed to take all the random scribbles and bits of verse that we'd collected from the personal effects of the deceased and actually put it together into a single document. Then he read it and came out looking like nothing special had happened. The next guy after him, not so lucky. But Dr. Coates, he carried on working for a few days after. Took measurements of this, made recordings of that, slipped into the background, out of my notice, while I focused on trying to figure out some way of getting the Third Testament scanned into a computer without it causing havoc. A lot like the people who read it, machines like to commit suicide about halfway through reading the Third Testament. Not Coates, though. He seemed just fine. Should have known better. First clue that something wasn't quite right was when I went to his office. A cramped space with metal walls and floors, no windows given it, was below ground, and a countertop full of equipment. It was always a mess in there, and usually a bit smelly too, but it was usually just that unwashed scientist smell. But one day when I went to call on him, he opened the door, and I got a whiff of something that was just. Smelled a little like death, only not quite. Just different, moldy almost. Of course, he was entitled to do some experiments on his own time, and that's what I figured it was. At the time, I wrote it off. Had other things on my mind. Only the smell got worse with time. Turned up day after day, and each time it stung my nose a little worse, hung around my sinuses a little longer. And Coates, he looked a little worse for wear each time too. Again, nothing serious. The kind of thing that's actually quite normal for a man like him. I'm used to seeing scientists fixate on a problem, something quiet they won't share with anyone else until they know for sure what they've got. That's what he was like. And I figured when he was ready, he'd either show me something that would blow my socks off, or it'd be something stupid like he got his microwave to evenly heat up his lunch by taking it apart and rewiring its insides. Sometimes I wonder if I'd caught it earlier, could I have done something about it? Someone smarter might have picked up the odd chemical mixtures on his shelf, or recognized the peculiar smells. Not me, though. All I can say in hindsight is thank fuck my office was above ground. By the time his little project had finished working its way through the floor he was on, he'd killed 36 people with his homemade nerve gas. Thankfully, the facility was prepared for that kind of attack, and the automated security systems had the entire level locked down very quickly, so the damage wasn't that bad. Could have been a lot worse. But what was weird was the venting system wasn't working. Should have cleared it all out in under a day, but 4 hours later, and the gas levels were the same. The investigation, at least at first, had to happen remotely. CCTV from his lab was spotty. Something was corroding the cameras, but based on some of his material requests, we guessed he'd been culturing some unusual fungus to create the bioweapon. Whatever it was potent, and we were helpless to do anything about it. We had to wait and hope to God whatever awful thing he'd concocted would wear out on its own. What little the CCTV could capture made for a grueling sight. 8 scientists dead at their desks, slumped over, blood pouring out their mouths. The fluid looked black on the grainy black and white monitor. But what upset me more were the assistants, dozens of young men and women who didn't really belong in that place. Too much to live for, and all of them so scared of what was going to happen to them. And they were just lying there in the middle of whatever it was they were doing. In the labs themselves, smashed beakers and machines in disarray. In their rooms, some of them lay peacefully sleeping. Others held each other in secret little trysts they thought no one knew about. All over the level, bodies lay on the floor in strange positions. And again, that black fluid leaking from every orifice, staining the floor, their faces, and their clothes, soaking their chests and groins. I remember sitting there and just watching them twitch and foam at the mouths, waiting for death to finally come. Even then, the hours ticked on as we waited for the systems to purge the gas. 12, 24, 48. Nothing happened. It was like everything in there was frozen in time. And then, somehow, the lights on that level went out. Emergency lighting came on, bathing everything in red, but combined with the low-quality cameras, it was like gazing at an old video game, grainy, fuzzy, low resolution. We figured that Coates must have rigged up a remote timer on the electronics, which wasn't a good guess since his specialty was biochemistry and the security systems were of the highest tier. But what else could it be? Wasn't like someone could have hit the circuit breaker. We knew eventually we'd have to go in there. 60 hours after shutdown, we just had to. There was too much high-value material to leave behind, and there were reports of strange noises down there. Guards posted to the door heard faint sounds on the other side. Footsteps, they reckoned. Of course I wrote that off. Utter nonsense, I told myself and them. And yet we still went in armed because, well, if Coates was smart enough to rig this whole nightmare, who's to say he didn't make himself a little gas mask to keep himself safe? You think I'd be used to working in hazmat suits, and I sort of am, but going into that sealed-off floor was something else. The visor felt restrictive. The squeak of the rubber suit was deafening. My breath was too loud. And every time the in-suit radio came to life with one of the soldiers' barks, I damn near jumped out of my skin. And then the door actually opened. Nothing could have prepared me for that. The air was thick with mist, which lit up harshly with the emergency lighting's red hue. Old metal grates, vents, open doorways. All of it either blood red or completely dark. There were far too many shadows for it to feel safe. Didn't help some of the bulbs were strobe lighting, rotating sirens that lit the place up in periodic flashes of crimson light. God, even the 4 soldiers next to me looked nervous. We passed more than a few bodies on our way to Coates' lab. All of them lay where they'd been on the CCTV, at least as far as I could tell. Sounds stupid, but I stared at a few of them closely just to make sure. All those reports of footsteps had started to worm their way into my brain. Couldn't shake the idea we weren't alone down there. When we finally opened the door to Coates, what I saw left me frozen to the spot. The soldiers focused on the strange growth off to one corner of the room, which registered to me only as a dim sort of collection of thick fungal petals crawling up the wall, her veins pulsating like capillaries in the eye. But to me, what really hit home was the empty desk. Last time we had reliable footage of that room, Coates had been lying there dead as a dodo, blood leaking from his still open eyes, pooling on the desk and dripping onto the floor. And that stain was still very much there. There was even the faint outline of where his head had been laying. But the man himself was gone. This, even more than the grotesque thing that took up one wall, terrified me. That quivering mass of fungus was pumping out enough toxic gas to kill half the base, but it was stationary at least. In another circumstance, I might have even found it fascinating. But Coates, he'd clearly gone off the deep end. Had he lain perfectly still for days on end to trick us? That didn't seem right. Again, I thought of the bodies we'd passed, the way they looked so still, but not lifeless. Like a porcelain doll, there was that slight suggestion of something working behind the eyes. "What do we do with this?" one of the men asked. "Take samples. Burn the rest," I replied. "If gas levels don't go down in a week, we'll have to purge the whole floor with phosphorus." The whole time I had my eyes on the space around us. Under the desk, up on top of the cupboards. If Coates wasn't at his desk, where was he? "Where the fuck did this thing come from?" the same soldier muttered as he laid a series of thermal charges on the fleshiest part of the mold. It seemed to flinch in response to his touch, but was otherwise benign. He probably took some of the subject's tissue samples. We know it propagates unusual levels of growth in plant and animal tissue. Explains why the gas levels don't go down. What's it metabolizing? I gave the soldier an odd look. What he said, "You aren't the only ones with an education." "Fair enough," I replied with a quick shake of the head. "It isn't metabolizing anything except his tissue. It's, well, bluntly, I mean, think of the fish and the bread, right? This is something we've known about his tissue samples for a while now. Spontaneous creation of matter and energy out of nothing. But to give Coates his credit, this is a pretty novel application. He's created an infinite bioweapon. Why?" I was about to reply, "I haven't the slightest fucking clue," when a loud bang drew our attention to the doorway. Outside lay a darkness broken only the strobing of a red light. Flashing on and off, it revealed, for just a single instant, the outline of a man standing in the hallway. The soldiers swore nervously as they raised their rifles. By the time the light came back, the figure was gone. "Who the fuck was that?" one barked. "Must be Coates," another replied. "Job's done," I cried while gesturing to the charges. "Let's get the fuck out of. There are no miracles left for you. You have made your own miracles." The words were growled so loud and deep, they seemed to vibrate my very bones. The soldiers snapped to attention, but me, I took a little longer to turn back to the corner of the room. I knew what I was going to see, but God, I didn't want to see it. "There are other gardens, but not for you. Do not spoil the other Edens." Coates emerged from the thing on the wall, pulling himself free with a wet squelch. He stood not naked, but nearly naked, as his skin had begun to absorb his clothes. He looked like a burn victim coated in algae. "He loves you. In spite of everything, he loves you. And there is a place in heaven for you all. But it is time to." I can't blame the soldier who pulled the trigger. It wasn't just the fact that Coates was speaking with a mouth that had grown grotesquely across his abdomen, but rather that the words were drilling straight into our heads like some pushing a hot needle straight into a dental nerve. It made my eyes cross, my ears ache, and my nose bleed. Two of the men had vomited, splattering the inside of their visors with thick fluid. They were the first to go. They didn't see what hit them, and I'm somewhat glad. Coates, angered by the gunshot, moved with the elegance of a dancer. I stumbled out into the corridor as he tore them apart, his arms seemingly flowing right through their biohazard suit. The remaining soldier, the trigger-happy one, was beside me as I fled. It wasn't far to the exit. I hoped we would make it the rest of the way without incident, that in just a few short hours I might be able to put the few images I had of Coates pulling flesh and fabric apart, like it was tissue deep into some recess of my mind, and just move on. But it was only a few short steps into the dark before the remaining soldier began to fire blindly at the corridor behind us. It was a mistake for him to turn around. In the fraction of a second where his eyes had been turned away, he missed one of the bodies lying on the ground. I jumped. He didn't. I was dimly aware of there being no one beside me only when the gunshots grew fainter and fainter as I left him behind. One of the shots dinged off a panel by my head, and to this day I suspect it was not a ricochet, but a deliberate attempt to get revenge for me abandoning him. Still, I didn't look back, not until I reached the secure door. I thumbed the keypad frantically, terrified as my ears registered the sound of approaching footsteps muffled by the biohazard suit. God, I couldn't stop myself. I looked. I had nothing else to do except wait for security to clear me and open the door, and there was no guarantee they'd even do that. I might be waiting forever, staring at nothing as Coates came closer and closer. Without even realizing what I was doing, I turned and saw the soldier with the gun. Jesus. Coates' office was out of sight, so I have no idea if he repeated this with the other two. But the man I saw, he was in pieces, yellow and red in ragged strips that coated the ceiling as much as the floor. And barreling towards me on all fours, legs and arms too long for a normal man, came Coates. Eyes wide, jaw distended, chunks of his head still missing. But his mouth, it silently spoke the same few words almost in time with his loping gallop, over and over and over. It would take days for me to even realize what it was he was saying. Thankfully, before he managed to reach me, the doors opened and a hail of gunfire filled the corridor ahead. Coates, fast as lightning, disappeared into some dark crevice, and I was dragged to safety before the worst might happen. As soon as I was on the other side, I told security to flood the place with phosphorus and everything was purged. White-hot fire on demand. By the time it was over, only metal remained, and even then, a lot of it had melted and cooled in strange shapes on the floor. I also went out of my way to kill any attempts at reclaiming the lost workspace. Higher-ups were pissed. All that square footage lost, but I said the risk of contamination was too great. Of course, I left out the part where I returned one quiet night a few days later and placed my ear against a thick steel wall that I knew ran close to one of the vents on that level. It was faint, but I heard Coates whispering. Only then did I finally get the final clue to what Coates had been saying as he came towards me in the flashing red of that darkened corridor. We love you, we love you, we love you, we love you, we love you. Even now the cameras show that level to be a sterile hollow space, but I cannot escape the feeling that if I were to open it I would see Coates come slithering out of some long-forgotten vent. Perhaps worse for wear given all the time that has since passed, but Coates nonetheless, terrifying and misshapen, but desperate to spread the very testament that twisted his mind and body, that caused him to try and breed something that might well have ended the entire world. And the worst thing of all, what he'd been saying to me in that corridor, what if it was true? What if he hadn't done it out of hate, but love? At the time I'd assumed the force we were dealing was hostile, but what if it wasn't? Everyone who goes near the Third Testament kills themselves, and until Coates I'd thought it some kind of twisted revenge. But what if that wasn't the case? What if he wasn't doing it out of spite or hostility? What would that mean for me? Forgiveness? If so, that terrified me because after everything I'd been through, I doubted I'd have the strength to resist that kind of offer. For weeks I lay awake at night, wondering just what the hell might be in those words that could compel people like Coates to do what they did. And yet, despite everything, I still haven't read the Third Testament. Coates was a genius, and he still gave in. I know that I did some pretty messed up stuff in the name of scientific curiosity, but, well, I guess I'm not ashamed to say I'm also a coward. I'm afraid of dying. Curiosity can only get you so far, and after seeing everything that happened to the people who read that thing, I couldn't bring myself to risk it. Whatever the Third Testament is, hearing it seems pretty bad for your health. I don't think I even deserve to be forgiven, if that's what he's offering. It was poetic justice that out of all the people who managed to make the evacuation, I wasn't one of them. Leaving on foot is hardly an option for me. I mean, even if I had the strength to hike through hundreds of miles of rainforest, I'd need to reach the outer fence first. And strange things have festered in the chemical pits where they disposed of the bodies. Soft mounds of ash and bone that sing from time to time, exciting the birds in the canopy to take off and make strange patterns in the sky. If they can sing, they must have mouths, right? And if they have mouths, what else? I think about Coates, about what kind of hands would reach out to drag me into those rotten pits of long dead flesh and drown me in filth, and I shudder. I could try and sneak past, but it really isn't safe outside the hospital. It isn't safe inside, to be fair, but what choice do I have? At least there's still power, internet, food to last me over a century. and the security doors that keep everything below sub-level 1 firmly locked away. While out there, well, I see things, sometimes, moving quickly between the old buildings. The trees shake and stir, and where the jungle now grows thick and heavy against one of the glass walls of the hospital, the vines twist and turn and spell out odd messages. I shut my eyes firmly whenever I have to pass them, and yet even blind I can hear the tightening of fibrous coils as the cloying flora scratch against the glass. They want me, hungering. All those corpses we buried out there, rotting, breaking down, contaminated with divinity. What strange waters flow through the soil in this place? Nothing could make me risk opening the doors and try walking through that vegetation. He might forgive, but I don't think my former test subjects have. And as for down below, you know I never met him while he was alive. Don't know where they got him from or even why. My bet, he pissed off the wrong people, got shot, and got back up. Maybe they shot him again and he got up again. Maybe they did it 5 times, 10 times. I don't know. Somewhere along the lines, someone worked out they had an anomaly on their hands. Maybe I wasn't the first person to even try cutting him open. It's just weird. No one ever told us who he was. We just knew. It'd be years before I wondered who mothered him, loved him, raised him. I often wonder if this was the way it was meant to go, or was it just an accident that he bumped into the wrong people at the wrong time? The Messiah came and the first thing we did was cut him up. No wonder we failed. Things in the project started to go really bad about 6 months after the first incision. High turnover amongst researchers was one thing, but, well, it turns out a lot of the soldiers had a religious inclination. So it wasn't just us dealing with visions and voices. At some point they worked out what they were part of. The agency likes compartmentalization, but it can only go so far. After the religious element became clear to the guys on the ground, things started to break down. It was one thing to control the scientists, but the guards were armed. When they broke hard. Most of his remains are stored on the lowest level where it's easiest to keep things cool. Outside there's this long corridor leading to the central chamber. Huge, wide enough to drive 4 or 5 cars side by side. And that was where the first guard hanged himself. Simple enough. They dragged him away and cleaned it up. It wasn't long after Coates. In fact, it was one of the men who had saved me at the door. But pretty soon another 2 guys went down there and hanged themselves. And then 5. And then 8. And then topside, some guys started blowing their brains out. In their barracks. In the canteens. Standing watch at the doors, looking out on the jungle, cigarette hanging loose on one lip. Seemed almost random, except there was a clear pattern of escalation. When those guys started killing their friends, that's when it reached the point where they couldn't ship new guys in fast enough to replace losses. Once that happened, orders started getting lost. Jobs started being left undone. One lab got written off because a test subject's body was left to fester over a weekend, and by the time they got the door open, there was flesh growing up the walls. Not enough manpower to deal with it, so they left it for another day and moved on. Only they forgot to tell the researcher who worked there, so come Monday he went in and had a hell of a surprise. Must have been like stepping into a wall of sourdough. I can only hope he suffocated and it was quick, but who knows? Not like that stuff has hard and fast rules. For all I know, he's still in there, screaming for air. Meanwhile, that tunnel, people just kept going down there and hanging themselves. I mean, every day I'd wake up and I'd be down a few researchers, and a couple more guards would be missing. Took a shockingly short amount of time for most of the 600 people on site to just disappear. God knows when security stopped taking the bodies down. Just another job that got lost in the growing panic. By the time evacuation orders came, we were down to 100 people. I estimate that around 400 killed themselves in that tunnel. I've only visited him once since the project shut down. Only had the guts to go looking once. Barely made it out alive. I felt compelled to try and face up to him. To acknowledge the role I'd played. Only that meant actually getting to the door at the end of the tunnel, which was, by this point, pitch black except for my torch, and blocked almost entirely with hanging bodies. So many, pressed together so close that I had no hope of making my way through without bumping into one. Reminded me of the jungle, funnily enough, of a thick claustrophobic forest made of dried skin and brittle ligaments, different colors and shapes, and of course different levels of decomp. Some had lost their noses, lips, and eyes. Others were a little bloated but still recognizable. Not friends, really. I don't think I ever actually made one solitary friend on that project, but colleagues. People who were under my charge. They looked sad. All of them looked sad. They should have been buried at home with their families, but instead they were locked all the way in the ass end of nowhere. Of course, you can bet your ass the agency will make sure no one ever knows the truth. You know, I still have contact with them. Anything I post gets screened. Arrogant bastards know that no one's gonna take me seriously. No record of this project anywhere. All those people just ghosts in a system too big for any one person to keep track of it all. You know how many people go missing in the United States in a year? What about Europe? Or the whole fucking world? God, this project was just a drop in the ocean. I wanted to put it to bed, to see if I could get some kind of answer from him. It was that idea, trying to get some resolution to this nightmare, that gave me the strength to push past the first dead body and go deeper into that tunnel. It reminded me of trying to make your way to the front of a gig, only deathly silent, and the people you barged past swung gently back and forth. The sound of makeshift nooses tightening in the dark. I think the worst part was the limited vision. My light was just a lone disc, and God, it was pitch black in that place. Like caving, only the floor is slick, and you don't have to worry about a ravine. Made me think of being at the bottom of the ocean. With all the corpses, visibility was never more than just a foot ahead. I remember panicking at the realization I could easily get turned around and, well, what if all those lost souls didn't let me go? What if I wound up going in circles for hours, days even, on end, just round and round? The nearest wall could be right there, and I wouldn't know it. Just bones and teeth and ribs and hanging entrails. All of it, all of them, cold to the touch. Freezing. Obviously that was why we'd put him down there. The place was cold, my own breath visible in the air. But the bodies were like the meat you grab out of a fridge in a supermarket, and it was just fucking awful. I found the fresh ones the hardest to stomach. A really rotten body looks almost like a prop. It isn't. Don't get me wrong. You look at it, and your brain tells you damn well it ain't a prop. But it's a hell of a lot easier to convince yourself it's just a thing when it hasn't got skin or eyes. But the fresh ones, sometimes they still had expressions like anger or sadness on their faces. They made me feel watched. And the fact they were cold and slick with condensation. Every time I bumped into one, it took everything I had not to let out a whimper. And they moved. They didn't move, not like that. But there were no drafts down there. It was perfectly still. They'd been perfectly still for months after the project shut down. And then I came along and disturbed them, and it was like a giant Newton's cradle. A static system that I put energy into. They began to sway and twist and bump. I'd knock one, and fraction of a second later it would knock me back, jostling against my cheek or my arm as inertia rocked it back and forth. 10 minutes in, too far to turn back. That was when the nightmare began. Started small. I lost my ability to track what body was where and which ones were sent swinging by my own clumsy movements. And then, fingers combed my hair. I cried out. Another set touched my beard, my face. I forced myself onwards and started making eye contact with one too many dead men for it to simply be an accident. Their expressions changed from sullen and listless to angry and cruel. Leering smiles and curled lips. Then came the unmistakable sensation of someone deliberately grabbing for my arm. I had to shake it loose, too afraid to look back and face the possibility that I'd see one of them moving and scowling. I pushed on, constantly having to shake cold fingers off my elbow or my collar. They groped incessantly, looking for anything to hold onto. Firm grips pinched my belly fat, my shoulders, my chest. And then they started reaching for my eyes. At one point I made the mistake of crying out, and a freezing cold finger with a slightly furry texture slid into my mouth. The only relief came when I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled. The entire time my mind raced with the terrible possibility that I really was just being sent in circles, over and over and over and over. and they were never going to let me leave. I would die down there, in the dark, smothered by their rotting hands. God damn. I came close to giving up. When my torch finally alighted upon an open space, I cried out. A heaving wet sob made of relief and joy, and my muscles, given new life, worked overtime to get me out of that horrible nightmare and into freedom. I didn't stop until I bumped my head against a steel wall with a dull clang and looked up to see the vault's door. At last, the place we'd frozen him. I got up with what little dignity I had left, brushed down my clothes, and risked only the briefest of glances back. The bodies looked inert now, just like they had before I entered. I could have tricked myself into thinking it was my imagination. Only half my shirt was now in tatters on the floor, and I could see strips of it still clenched in a few of their hands. I did my best to compose myself, and I entered the vault. We hadn't left him in a very nice state. The plan was to catalog everything. Yes, we'd excised the most, striking biological anomalies, but the remaining flesh. I mean, we wanted to know everything. Every last capillary, every last cell. We wanted it recorded. So we had this special machine flown in. It works by taking a piece of flesh and slicing into a layer that's barely a micrometer thick and depositing it onto a slide. That slide is digitized and then stored in specialized cold refrigeration units. It's usually used on a sample not much bigger than a potato, but for him, we had something specially made, frozen. Stood vertical. We put him on the machine where it worked, creating about one slice every 3 hours. Only at the end, well, first no one came to take the slides away, so they had gathered on the floor below in a terrible mess. And second, no one had bothered to check if he was still dead. Stupid of us, really. Of course he came back to life. Only this time, he didn't get to leave the cave. I often wonder if he had anything left to say. But by then the machine had reached his nose. Just his eyes and the top of his head looking right at me. Following me. God, we made a fucking mess of things, didn't we? Made the Romans look gentle in comparison. I fell to my knees and begged for forgiveness, and the worst part was he gave it. Obviously not verbally, but it shouldn't surprise you to know he had other ways of putting thoughts in my head. I was so angry at myself. I was positive I'd find some kind of punishment waiting for me. But I didn't. He forgave me, told me I was loved. After everything I'd done, I mean. God, that hurt the most. I didn't deserve it. Still don't. And then he gave me the Third Testament, or rather the Cliff Notes. Not enough to drive me nuts, but the gist of it, so to speak, did a number on me anyway. By the time I was done sobbing on the floor, I looked up and he was gone. Nothing remained. Just broken glass and a machine cutting empty air. Going back through the tunnels was no easier than going in, but I hardly remember it. I lost a couple weeks after that little trip down below, but eventually I came to in my office. Now I stay above ground. I've asked for rescue, but the agency feels I best serve my country by staying where I am, making sure nothing else leaks out. It's fucked, but I think for once they might be right. I've considered sharing what he gave me. Considered even putting it in this bit of writing here. Might even go get the full testament and upload it, but that involved reading it, and like I said, I'm a coward and I don't want to die. Everyone who reads it dies by their own hand. I guess all I can say is, the Third Testament, it's something of a warning. An outline of what's coming our way. So bad that he came just to offer us a way out. A promise that there's somewhere else, and an acknowledgement that we're going to need it. Makes me think of Coates. Smartest man I ever met, whose first reaction to knowing what's on the way was to try and engineer something to wipe humanity all out. Given what we did to him, I wonder if we don't deserve it.